Rieser has been a longtime member of Hakafah. He has been a teacher of ours in the adult ed for a number of years, and his interest in history and all things Jewish has grown throughout the time. I wanted to hear from him as to why that was, and I wanted you to hear it as well. David Rieser, how you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good. I haven't seen you since Tuesday night at Torah class. It seems like forever. All
It's
right.
like forever.
I'm telling you, because nowadays a week is like forever. Although it seems a little calmer now.
Yes.
Question for you: You have been, you've had a really interesting journey through Hakafah. From my perspective, I mean, it was 15 years ago, the B'nai Mitzvah, 17
Something
years ago.
like that, yeah.
That's you started engaging in that, and then all of a sudden you started teaching the adult ed, and you're on the Israel trip, and you're in the Torah class. Talk to start out our conversation. Can you speak about that evolution, that interest, that where did all this come from?
Well, yeah, I think it's come from being more comfortable, uh, both with my own Jewishness and with the organization in a way that I wasn't before. I had started out at another another temple that actually was a lot like the temple I grew up in, which wasn't necessarily a great recommendation because it was just kind of cold. It was very well organized, but it was cold. People were nice as far as that went. I still remember vividly the first day, and to stop, the reason I joined was to make sure I had someplace to take my kids to Sunday school so they could learn something about Judaism, and to have a place where I could go to services. And so I was at this other temple, and then I'm good friends with the Persefields who used to be members, and they suggested this as a place that I might like because I started asking around. And I still remember the first day of Sunday school after I joined, and I brought the kids in, and I probably had more people coming up to me and asking and talking to me and being friendly in one morning than I ever had at the other place.
That's because we're
And
all
I'm
sick
like,
of
okay,
we were all sick of each other, and we needed someone new to talk to.
yeah, there was certainly a fresh meat attitude about the oh, here's somebody who hasn't heard about my stories. Perfect. Um, so so I did that, and then when the kids were done with Sunday school, and I don't remember exactly how it came in. I talked to Jackie Spector had given a, a, a talk at one of the high holiday services, and she talked about adult B'nai Mitzvah. And I had always wanted to get bar mitzvah. I had not done it as a kid just because the one thing my parents let me skate on was Hebrew school, partly, and then partly it was kind of the times and some other stuff. But anyway, I hadn't gotten bar mitzvah as a kid, and it just felt like a real lack. And then once I heard there was a adult B'nai Mitzvah, a path forward on that, I thought, well, this is something I want to do. And then having done that, and that was a spectacular experience, and a great group of people. And having done that, I was like, okay, now I don't know how quite to say that. I feel more Jewish. I'm okay with being Jewish. I can tell people I'm Jewish. I've been bar mitzvah. And that's a really goofy thing to think on the one hand, because it's the same situation. But on the other hand, it did feel like I was closer to um, doing, being a part of the congregation, being a part of the religion, et cetera. And then, I started doing the history. Even though I'd read a ton of history before, I hadn't really focused on any Jewish history. And I think that was part of not being entirely comfortable with the Judaism.
Hmm.
And so then I started reading that, and then you got me doing the classes.
I got you doing the
And
classes.
well, I don't know that I would have done it had you not suggested, oh, maybe you want to do a class of this. I mean, I didn't go into. I mean, it was because I was reading Josephus, and the reason I was thinking about this. The reason I was reading Josephus is that I'm still intrigued by the logistics, by the physical logistics of animal sacrifice and how they kept the place from reeking from all the animal waste, because that's what I do, environmental law. So I'm dealing with, people dealing with waste products all the time. And I'm like, boy, they're just generating a ton of putrescent waste here.
Oh,
How do
what
they
a great
manage it?
word, putrescent. What a great.
Well, it's what it is. It's
Yeah.
decaying flesh, rotting flesh. And it's why, there's a part of the South Branch of the Chicago River called Bubbly Creek. And you know why it's called Bubbly Creek?
Because of all the stuff.
It was the part of the Chicago River that drained the stockyards.
Ah.
And so that's what happens to putrescent waste. Anyway, needless to say. And I still don't have a good answer to that, by the way. And then it just sort of went from there. And I did the Israel trip just because I was in a place where had the time and resources to do it. And that was a great experience. So,
So you said that,
so here I am.
so you said it a few times. You didn't feel Jewish. You didn't feel what's the word you used? Something like that. What?
Comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable with the Judaism.
Yeah. Why not?
With my Judaism.
Yeah. Why not?
I'm sorry?
Why not?
I don't know is the short answer. I think, it sort of reflects the duality in my parents, because my dad was from a very traditional German Jewish family that wasn't religious at all. And my mom had come from a Russian immigrant background and had grown up conservative. And I'd grown up going to temple, but not having been bar mitzvahed. So even though I had learned all this stuff, and I still felt it was important to go to the high holidays and be a member of a congregation, I didn't feel I was actually doing very much about any of it, other than what I was doing, which was teaching my kids Judaism. And, so there was just a step removed, if you will, from the whole thing, although obviously it's something I care about and something I wanted to be and something I wanted to pass to my children. For the folks at home, my wife is not Jewish and hasn't converted, although frankly she's making a great Jew, but that's another story. So it just was a step removed, I think is the answer. And
Okay.
so some of this is about clearing that step and making that step to enter into it more fully.
So you really jumped in on the history part and on the Torah side, and I want to focus on the history part for a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's just why history?
Well, because it's something I know how to read, I think is the answer. It's something I understand.
Say more about that. What do you mean you understand history?
Well, it was what my college degree was in. And I went through the experience in college because I started out as many of us did, pre-med, and made it through the University of Chicago. I made it through the weed out chemistry class and did perfectly well. And I just remember vividly completing the third quarter was quantum mechanics, and we had an essay final on quantum mechanics, and that was every bit as ugly as that sounds like it was. But I felt like I did pretty well on it and gotten through it. And then I started studying for my econ final, and I hated econ just as a theory. There was something about it that just bothered me. But in studying it, I'm like, I know this stuff. I know this social science stuff. I mean, my mind just works so it grasps the issues just much more easily and clearly in a way that it didn't for science. And so then after that, I decided I would probably go to law school. And then it was between history and poli-sci, and history was just something that was just more real to me, for want of a better word. So so I know how to, I sort of know how to study history and break it down and think about it and deal with it in a comprehensive way. That for me is just a lot easier than any other things that I study and look at.
So, in all your study of history, I too was a history major. I went into college hating history, and then I
Mm-hmm.
had a freshman survey class, and the
Mm-hmm.
prof was phenomenal, and then I was just
Yeah.
boom from there. So I was a history major too. So I ask this or make this statement slash question in that light, right? The more history that I study now as an adult, the more I realize that we have no idea what really happened.
I mean, yes, of course that's true, because the more you read, the more you see that there are gaps, and you're talking about things, especially when you're talking about Jewish history, a chunk of it happened, excuse me, um, at a time when people didn't write, and there's no written text, and it's anybody's guess as to what happened. And the more you read, the more you get away from the great man theory of history, and the more you get to polarized view of history, the less you feel like we really understand as a total thing what went on. And so it's far more up to us. And I guess the further away we get from kind of hierarchies about, well, this guy really knows his stuff, or this guy really knows his stuff, and more towards, well, there's all these different voices. Just like everything else, the more you feel like, man, I really don't know, because there's a million voices yelling at me about what the answer to this question is, and how do I decide among all this stuff.
Which is why I subscribe to the spaces in between theory. Right? Is that when the more I read, the more I'm trying to get an idea of the reality, quote unquote, which is the space between what everyone's saying. Right.
Right.
Um, so let me ask you that in terms of now, you have been teaching at Hakafa, the adult ed a class for like 10 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like forever for you, I know. So you've done quite. I mean, you've sent yourself on a progression, and your classes are now some of the most popular ones that I hear about all the time.
Oh,
Um,
that's great.
you started at Temple Times, and you've made it all the way up to Moses. Have you made it? You did Moses Mendelssohn this year. Is that who you
Mendelssohn,
did?
right, right, right.
Okay. So looking at that scope of that history, or even go farther than that, since you've been studying biblical history now through our text study, our Torah study, our Tanakh study for years now, what sticks out to you in terms of Judaism as history?
Um, Man, well, there's a lot of it. Um, I
There's a
I
whole history
once
of it.
I once worked. There's a whole history of it. Well, and it's a long history. I worked with the first law firm I worked at. There were a couple of older, it was a 3-man partnership, and then the partners were significantly older men, and one of them and I got to be better friends, and I was in and we were talking, and he asked me what I studied, and I told him history, and he said something like, yeah, I remember studying history. There was, when I was in college, it was okay, and now they're doing all this revisionist stuff, and and it was sort of like it was easier when I was studying it. And I said, well, there was less of it then. Fortunately, he thought it was fun. Thought that was funny. But what's on one level, Jewish history isn't any different than anyone else's history, right? Everybody, you take somebody from a non-Jew from Poland. The history of Poland is as messed up as you could possibly imagine. The history of, I read this book called Faust Metropolis on the history of Berlin. Saddest thing you've ever read.
Hmm.
It's just really messed up. So, but of course, since I'm not Polish, and even though I've got German background, different feelings about Berlin, it's not as resonant as the Jewish history. And so I think anytime somebody studies history or studies anything, you're doing it because it resonates with you in a way that other stuff doesn't.
Yeah.
Um,
So what
and of
resonates with you?
course, there's a lot of Jewish history that's very polemic. And so part of the task of looking at this is to try and sort out the polemic stuff from the other stuff. And there's a huge industry in studying Jewish history, and some of it is very polemic driven. You know, even something as goofy as who invented hummus. Was hummus a Jewish invention or an Arab invention? It's a stupid discussion, right? But it's all part of the polemic, the Israel polemic of, we're these types of people and we've been here for a long time. So there's a lot to sort out. And that's, as we get closer to the present in sort of the history progression, I'm really trying to think at what point do I have to go back? Because I really don't want to I don't want to be the person who talks about the Holocaust, for example. And I definitely don't want to be the person who talks about Israel. And part of that is I don't know enough about Israel, and I don't have the emotional drive on it that I know a lot of people do. And so, for one thing, just sorting out what polemic we're going to talk about. And some of it is just not wanting to personally deal with, choices I might make in how I approach it. Because I would probably approach it in a less Israel heroic way than other people might. So.
And why is that an issue?
Well, I don't want. I love the discussions we have in class, but I don't want a screaming match.
Yeah.
And the only area, I've had people really respond strongly to stuff we talked about, but I've never had like a really emotional response, and it's just not something I want to deal with if I had a choice.
In the spirit of polemics, then, for the classes you've been teaching, if there was a Jew of color or a Sephardic Jew, African Jew, listening to your classes, would they agree that that's Jewish history?
No, and Steve brought that up.
Steve
from our Torah class.
Oh, Steve Greenberg. Okay.
Yeah. Brought that up after the first discussion of Mendelssohn, which is to say, everything you're talking about is Ashkenazi. It's all Ashkenazi. And there were other Jews besides the Ashkenaz. And I'm like, number one, you're perfectly happy to teach a class if you'd like. But number two, he was completely correct. And the fact is I know a lot less about Sephardic Judaism. And it's at a point now, and I talk less about it, although to be fair, the Maimonides discussion was really about the origins of, and to a certain extent, the Kabbalah discussion involved the Sephardic Jewish experience on that level. But the fact is, I don't know it as well. And I'm going to need to deal with it because I think the next discussion is going to be about emancipation. And the Sephardic and Ashkenaz Jews had a lot of conflicts about that. And the Sephardic Jews in general, and for reasons I don't understand yet, were far more integrated into European society before the Ashkenaz were. And were actually, as they were talking about emancipation in France, for example, before the revolution, there was a discussion about whether they would actually make common cause with the Ashkenaz because no one liked the Ashkenaz.
Right.
And they felt it wouldn't help sell their own emancipation to have everybody's image be these Eastern European Jews. And so it's a very different culture and a different history. So I would say that somebody listening to me, and Steve brought it out, and he was absolutely correct. He said, well, everything you're talking about, certainly once we started talking about Europe, it's been the Ashkenaz experience. And that's, there's no question that that's right. And it should change. I need to learn more.
Well, that's also post-Enlightenment scholarship tended to be white European colonial scholarship, and we're just beginning to catch up now in a way to give legitimacy to other voices. Right?
Well, yeah, but you could do white Europeans and still talk about the Sephardic Jews. I mean, you're not going to be talking about the Sephardic Jews in the Maghreb or the Middle East,
right.
But you're going to be talking about the Sephardic Jews of Europe, and that's a whole source of conflict right there. One of the things that's clear from the Mendelssohn discussion is that how many German Jews in particular really had a conflict with how they were a part of European society and still maintain their Jewishness. And for a lot of them, the answer was to stop being Jewish. And then you had just really extraordinary leaders in the 19th century who were one or two generations removed from Jewish royalty, for want of a better word. From Karl Marx's grandfather was a prominent rabbi to Benjamin Disraeli, who, despite the name, was no longer Jewish, because I think it was his father who had converted, because Jews in Britain were not able to serve in the government because they weren't part of the Anglican Church.
Okay, so then let me ask you. Then we're going to jump then, because I was going to ask you more about history. Maybe I'll come back to that. But you just went somewhere, because the answer to what you just said is Reform Judaism, right? That's the space
right.
that Reform Judaism tried to fill. Is
right.
Not the way out, but the way to stay in, still have meaning, and still be part of something bigger. Has it worked?
Right.
Did it work?
Oh, did it work? I mean, yes. You think about, it's hard to imagine American Judaism being the way it is without Reform Judaism. So what's
American? What's American Judaism like? I was going to ask that. So you're giving me all kinds of openings here.
I know, of course I am. But of course, the question you asked, did Reform Judaism work? And of course, the answer is, well, what does that mean? What did it work for? And so, did it keep? If you look at it as saying, did it keep the numbers of people who identify as Jewish fairly large and a fairly significant portion of the community, the larger community in whatever country? Did it accomplish that end, which is what it was designed for? So the answer to that is yes, because not everybody bolted to become non-Jewish the way that was the answer the people in Germany and Berlin in particular, that was the answer they had for it. And so like 5 of Mendelssohn's 6 children converted after he and mom died. And then the one that didn't convert, I think a generation down the road, they converted. So
it did not take long. It did not take long.
Pardon?
It did not take long.
Right. And Mendelssohn's path was very difficult. He did it with grace, and it was easy for him, but he was a really special guy. Mm-hmm. So did it work in the sense of maintaining a broad sense of Jewishness that was integrated into a community? Let's add that factor. And you think about the impact of, and let's go back to the Ashkenaz for that matter, the impact of the Ashkenaz on American culture. Spectacular, right? Because it was a Jewish presentation that didn't require people to be closed off from the community. And so it opened up Jewishness to the community, food, from the culture, from the talking like this, in a way that couldn't have happened otherwise. from the Orthodox perspective, it's a terrible thing because it gives people a way to call themselves Jewish who aren't really Jewish. There are Orthodox who will say that it led to Hitler and the Holocaust. And, that's the part of the discussion that says, well, if everybody's not keeping the covenant, then the Jewish community will suffer. So on that level, it worked, and here we are. There's issues, God knows.
So in 1999, 2000, with the presidential election, right? Joe Lieberman was on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone was talking about us being in this period of philo-Semitism. I want to juxtapose that on January 6th and what we've seen and what came out about Representative Green, who talks about that
Mm-hmm.
Jewish laser beams caused the fire. Which is
I was going
clear.
to ask you how we got on the list to direct where that's going to go now.
So it's clearly the anti-Semitism. Where do you think we are? And when we talk about it working, and you talk about us being integrated, and I would agree we're pretty well integrated. Do you see us in the spectrum of philo versus anti in terms of Semitism? Are we really integrated in a philo way, or are we really not, and we're just kind of fooling ourselves in the anti way? Which voice do you hear as the voice of American society?
Well, so philo and anti aren't that far apart, right? So you got people, and Donald Trump's a perfect example. He doesn't want black guys counting his money. He wants short guys with yarmulkes counting his money.
His quote, not yours. Go ahead.
That's exactly right. He he talks to the Jewish, had like talks with Jewish people, and it was all Jewish organizations. Was, well, you people are so smart, but you're interested in business, so you should like me. So that's all of that stereotypic. I mean, he likes that stereotype. He doesn't really like Jews.
What about his daughter? His daughter's one.
Well, and he's got them, and what was there was some comment about they were going to have another. There was something about where he said, I got enough Jews in my family. So I think there's always. I think one of the things about the United States is that, and its history is that there's always this tension between the Yahoos, the respectable Yahoos, all of whom are anti-Semitic, and people who just don't care that much, and who's just, well, everybody should be who they are. And right now we're just in a very high Yahoo point in this country, where these issues come out more and more. I have friends, particularly friends whose parents were Holocaust survivors or not survivors, who always mentally have their bags packed, as Jews have for centuries, and see all of this stuff as, the clouds, the pending storm. And I just don't see the United States as a country going fully in that direction. But the voices are stronger now than they've been probably at any time since the 20s. On the other hand, you think the 20s, you had the Klan, you had all these other anti-Semitic voices, and then they quieted down, but they didn't go away. I mean, my grandfather was a lawyer in a Jewish law firm, a prominent Jewish law firm, Sonnenschein and now Denton's. He had tremendous credentials. He was a great lawyer. He couldn't have worked at Kirkland or some of the other white shoe firms. And that was until the 50s. So, the loud voices against Jews were quieted during that time, and after the Holocaust, everybody was pretty revolted by the idea of anti-Semitism, where that would go, but that didn't stop people from being anti-Semitic.
So, I actually, I push back greatly on the idea that one, that history is doomed to repeat itself, and that he who does not, or she who they who do not read history are doomed to repeat it. I don't buy that at all.
No, no.
Uh, which means I'm about to ask a question around that. Um, that being said, is there anything from American history beyond what you just said that gives you an indication of which way it will go vis-a-vis us?
I mean, my indication, I mean, despite the fact that 72 million people voted for Trump, my feeling about where it's all going is that by and large, there's something about Trump that's sui generis, right? That he's just a really unique person with a really unique voice that really resonated with a lot of people, unfortunately. And I've made the example to Shabtai Zvi with you as somebody who's on one level a complete nut job, but on the other level, really whose voice resonated with people in a certain way, that they did stuff that they would never have dreamed of. And if somebody they knew did the same thing, they would think they were idiots.
For the record, Shabbatai Tzvi, 17th century false messiah. I just wanted to get that out there to people.
Viral messiah, because as I had this discussion with an Orthodox associate of at the law firm, and he said, "Oh, it's the false messiah." I said, "Well, we don't know that, right?"
That's very funny. That's very funny.
Well, but you know, we don't. Anyway, so but I don't see America as a whole doing that, going that way. I mean, yeah, what the drive is towards multiculturalism, and
the urban drive,
right, because that's where everybody is.
Yeah.
And certainly, but you know, in the rural areas, people, you know, in these towns in Iowa that have packing plants are having to come to deal with the fact that they have Mexican restaurants. Well, the food's pretty good, you know, and so it's all of this exposure thing. So I see at the end of the day, the country as a whole is moving towards a more multicultural. There are a lot of people who are really upset with that, and that's one of the drivers in what's going on. But it's hard to see this coming back, or the country as a whole adopting the idea that whatever's wrong is the fault of the Jews. People are much louder about saying that than they used to be. There's no question that that's going on, and people have to be alert to it. But you know, I think for an everyday person, it's all like, I gotta go to work, you know? Why am I gonna worry about this?
So do you think though, so what I hear you saying is that it's trending towards this kind of multicultural kind of, if not tolerance, acceptance. You gave the example of your father in Sun and Shine in the 50s, and grandfather, I'm sorry, as opposed to Kirkland and the like. Do you see that same kind of evolution as an inevitability vis-a-vis women and African Americans, people of color in our country too? Do you think we're going to get there?
Yes, but it's going to be a lot more work. I mean, so I'm in a huge international law firm, and like all of them, there aren't enough people of color, and there are a lot of women, but they're not always in, or they haven't been, although it's more and more in positions of power. And there are structural things that make both of those things difficult to achieve. And at the end of the day, what you need, and what I think we have in my firm, to be honest, is management just making a strong push towards different ways that you can change that. So for example, they've been doing a whole series on African American history, and have had speakers on Black struggles in law firms, and in different aspects of the African American struggle, which, having grown up in Hyde Park, I'm familiar with. But you know, there's plenty of people who have grown up not remotely being familiar with any of this. And so anytime that that's propagated on a firm-wide level, I think that's it's not the only thing, but certainly an important step in socializing people, the idea that there's other people out there who haven't gone through white suburban school systems and face challenges because of that aren't of their making, So it's not a matter of being lazy and not working hard enough. There's structural problems that present themselves. And the same thing is with women, although there are a lot of women and a number of them in positions of power in the firm. So that's changing. It's certainly not gone. There was a meeting, it was a couple of years ago, where one of the main guys in our office, not in the firm, but just started talking about pregnancy and just said the stupidest damn things. And then everybody called him on it. And the person who's responsible for the Chicago office made it clear it wasn't acceptable, and people really hopped on it. So my sense is that for the organizations that are working on it, that's changing. And another area of change is that there's a number of corporations that have said that requires part of a pitch or having or retaining a law firm that you show what your diversity activities are and want to see a diverse group working on their files. So that's another direction of change.
I always worry about when we go into that kind of place and space, I always worry about what I'll call the NFLification of diversity, right? Is that all of a sudden their Black Lives Matter? All of a sudden they went from not allowing people to kneel for the Star Spangled Banner to promoting the kneeling, right? I mean, so how much of it is legit? How much of it is economic pressure? How much of it, et cetera? For these pitches, how much do those companies really want diversity, and how much do they want to know that they're asking the question so that they come off as that?
Right. I mean, who's really walking the walk here? And that's what it comes down to. I mean, I'll say the NFL. I haven't seen that they've said it's okay for people to kneel. I watch a lot of Premier League soccer. They kneel. Everybody kneels before every game.
It was an exaggeration with them, everyone kneeling, but they changed their whole tune after George Floyd, and it wasn't out of a love for African Americans. They didn't all of a sudden start listening to Malcolm Jenkins, right? For some reason, there was an economic decision made by the upper echelon that we better get on the bandwagon here.
But think about what that economic decision says. I mean, these big companies, it's not, and having worked for a lot of them, it's not the sole consideration, but it's an awfully big one. So if they see their market having a problem with positions that they're taking, political or cultural positions that they're taking, that means that there's enough people pissed off about it to make a change, and that they need to do something. It's the same thing with companies deciding they're not going to give to the 157 or whomever it was congressmen who voted against the election. But what that means, I mean, they always do stuff for money, and that's kind of those are those creatures. And we live in a capitalist society, and it's got a lot of issues. But that's one of the ways in which it functions. So if there's a lot of pressure to behave in these ways that, from a progressive standpoint, we find are better, that's a good thing, and it really doesn't matter why they're making the change. And then once they make the change, it starts being integrated. I mean, there are certain people who, no matter what, they're going to be racist.
So wait a minute, David, you just pushed back on my cynicism by saying, who the heck cares as long as they make the right decision? Does it matter? Darn you for saying that.
Well, I mean, it's like any other moral decision. I mean, on the one hand, you want people to believe in a certain way, but people believe what they're going to believe. But as long as they're acting, and maybe it's the essence of Judaism, the important thing is, what do people do?
Thank you, Rabbi, for that one. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Well, it is. I mean, that's the key. What are the actions? And as long as the actions are positive, that's a big step. And then it also feeds on creating a mentality which is different, which is, well, you can't sit around in a polite society that I'm involved in and use racial slurs. And that's a real change.
Yeah.
And there are people who are still pissed off about that.
Yeah.
And then you look, I mean, on TV, this is a silly thing to be conscious of, but it is something I'm conscious of because of the times I grew up in. The number of interracial couples in advertising.
Popped up in July and August and are still there. You see them in just about every ad sequence. You see at least one.
Yeah, and interracial and Asian and white and it's like, oh, because I mean, it was what was the show? I mean, there were so many shows in the '60s that sort of tried to deal with what role the Black people would have on them, and typically it was a menial or lesser role, and then that changed. But the idea of a black and white marriage, an Abby and Rose marriage, you couldn't have done that until recently.
And I mean, now we're doing a page of Talmud as we go flowing from place to place, and a critique of that, right, was the biggest critique of the Cosby Show. I might have talked about this with somebody else on one of these. I don't remember now. The biggest critique was, as wonderful it was as normalizing middle class and upper middle class African Americans in society in a way that haven't been prior to that. That was the success of the Cosby Show, even given what happened with Cosby thereafter, right? Is that at the same time, it allowed white America to claim to be post-racial, that all the problems that were happening in the Black community were not even addressed. And it became a matter of it's their fault. It reinforced the pulling yourself up by the bootstraps instead of taking a step back and saying, wait, African Americans have been able to be successful and we should normalize that, but also see the systemic causes that you related to earlier that are keeping people poor, that are keeping people economically disadvantaged, et cetera.
Well, of course, it's hard to do a sitcom involving systemic racism.
That's true.
Unless you want to say that that's what All in the Family was about, but I haven't seen it enough to think about it from that direction. I mean, I watch old movies, and I was watching an old movie I hadn't seen in years, literally, Captain Blood with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland. I love this stuff, and that may be a character flaw, but whatever. And what was interesting, among the things that was really interesting about it, was about these British guys, white guys, being sentenced to be in slavery in Jamaica, and then essentially revolting and becoming pirates, and then being forgiven, and then taking action on behalf of what they called England, British Empire. And I was thinking, lovely, all these great things about freedom, but there were a lot more Black slaves. And you couldn't do a movie in the 30s about that was happy and saw the Black guys as great people, where the Black guys revolted, became pirates, criminals, and then were able to be turned around and be servants of the empire.
Yeah.
So it was, I mean, there was a level on which it was really weird, because it was really the slavery part of it was the African experience, but of course it was being co-opted by white people in the service of this silly movie.
And to your point, the good thing is then you see something like Bridgerton, which I did not see, but I've read a lot about.
I haven't seen it either.
Maybe I saw the first one. Rona watched it all. I said it was very good, but just now the integration of African American actors, or just Black actors, as given roles that used to be only for white people, changes the dynamic. So like the commercials do, like the Cosby Show, but at the same time, we cannot let up and then forget about the very strong, systemic, purposeful forces that are out there that are making it so difficult for the majority of people of color.
Right, but I think it may make being Pollyanna here. I think the more people see Black people as part of the fabric, that maybe it makes some of those discussions easier. So, if you're not a dehumanized, if you're not, Jimmy Walker was the dynamite guy
Yeah.
from,
Yeah.
if you're not the stereotypic person, but instead real human beings, they're like other real human beings, then those discussions get easier. I mean, that was the theory of integration. People obviously weren't ready for and aren't still ready for integration. But anything that gets people looking at other people as human beings is an advantage. It's a step forward, let's put it that way. But it's not the end of the journey by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, I got two more questions for you.
Yeah.
Question number one: your dad was living in Wyoming.
Yeah.
In Cody?
Jackson Hole.
Jackson. And how long was he in Jackson Hole for?
50, 40 years, something like
Yeah.
that.
So speaking as a Midwestern, now city suburban Jew, what was he thinking? What was it like? What was that like for him being a Jew in Jackson Hole, Wyoming? And what was that like for you having a Jewish father in the middle of Wyoming? It's germane to this conversation, more or less.
I mean, I again remember he had grown up in a German Jewish family that wasn't remotely religious. Although I make the point when we talk about lawyers marketing, and that's a new thing, and that the lawyers of, say, my grandfather's generation didn't have to go market and bring in clients. And I tell people that my grandfather belonged to 3 synagogues, not because he was religious, but because he was a tax lawyer living in Highland Park. So you go where the customers are. Anyway, so he's not very religious, and the lack of Jewishness, I don't know. I think that got to him on some level, but fundamentally, one of the things this guy loved to do just about more than anything else in the entire world was ski. And he loved to be outside. And his dad was a prominent lawyer, and he was Julius Rosenwald's tax lawyer, very involved in the Rosenwald Foundation.
Oh, wow.
So Dad had grown up in this household where you were expected to study and do things, and he really didn't like study, and he wanted to be outside. And it was just sort of, I think, a constant tension for him. So he was never ever comfortable in a 9-to-5 world. He wanted to be outside, and he wanted to be skiing. And when my parents broke up, this was an opportunity for him to redo his life. And so he went out to Jackson and he skied, and he became a ski instructor and continued to be a ski instructor. They wouldn't let him teach classes because he couldn't do anything, but well into his 80s. I mean, until he was 85 or something like that. And then when he got sick then and couldn't ski anymore, that's about when he passed away. I was giving a talk at a memorial we had for him out there. And I said he was probably the longest serving employee of the Jackson Hole Ski Corp. And the guy who was president of the Jackson Hole Ski Corp came up to me afterwards and said, yeah, that was absolutely right. Because typically people don't stick around or stay teaching skiing into their 80s. But he still, he was still, his basic background was community organizer. So he's still a community organizer at heart, and he did positive stuff and did a lot of different types of social activities in the community. And it being Jackson, which is different than any other part of Wyoming, there were some Jews there. I think they had enough to have services periodically. And then after I got bar mitzvahed, he decided to get bar mitzvahed. And it was written up in the Jackson paper, like a huge spread about his bar mitzvah. It was hysterical.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful out there. I love Wyoming. I love the vast nothingness. I've only driven through it twice. That's all I've experienced it.
That part of Wyoming, I mean, there's other parts of Wyoming, which are Rock Springs, for example. not fun, but Jackson's gorgeous.
All right, last question for you. I want to come back to the history thing, and I'm going to come back not to the history that you teach, but come back to the Torah class, now Tanakh class. You've been in now we've been doing it for 8 years at least. This particular starting
Hmm.
from the beginning on Tuesday nights. And let me just mark that
Right. And I didn't start until like into Exodus
That's okay.
at some
I
point.
forgive you. But you are still the
Thank you.
one. I mean, you were the one that was, even after you moved to Hyde Park, was driving up here for Tuesday night, which was great advertisement. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. So thinking about the scope of the characters that we have met in Tanakh up until this point, who resonates with you most and why?
Well, that's an outstanding question in terms of who resonates, because as you know, you don't get a sense of character except for a couple of people, because they're just not enough. There's not enough discussion about them. So the people whose character you get to and at least get a sense of are, that we've covered so far, have been Moses, and you get a tremendous sense of his character, and that's a fascinating. The interactions between Moses and God are really extraordinary in terms of a human relationship. And then now David, and as I say in class, I'm flabbergasted by the level of detail that the David stories have, and how clearly his character is revealed, and how on one level it's not remotely positive, but on the other level, and this is because I know people like this, and I work with people like this is exactly the way that big leaders behave.
Hmm.
And to have that kind of vivid display of being exactly the kind of human being that becomes a big time macher one way or the other, and the manipulative and the vision and all of the rest of it, and the ability to see what's going on. It's extraordinary. So I don't know that it resonates with me in the sense that I think it's an extraordinary portrait, which I'm really excited to learn more about. But so those are the guys. So they're both leaders, and of course that's primarily what the book is about,
Hmm.
is leaders. I think I indicated I felt bad for Saul. I think Saul got a rotten deal out of that, and I didn't expect to.
Hmm.
But just sort of seeing how he gets to where he gets, and that everybody, God, Samuel, everybody used him to put him in that spot. The authors, for that matter.
So let me ask you one more question then. Since is there anything else that it has been unexpected in terms of the biblical narrative for you?
I mean, on one level, all of it, because I mean, and that's a stupid answer, but
No.
there's so much there. And one of the great things about the class is that, through our discussion, we get a much better sense of, sort of all of the layers. And so I guess what I didn't really expect is the number of layers on which it worked, and communicated information. So the idea of what people's names mean, or what tribe they're from, or how this was a Judah-driven narrative as opposed to a Israel-driven narrative, and the importance of that. Now, some of that I picked up from the book Who Wrote the Bible, which is really a useful book. But I hadn't appreciated the layers of information that are contained in
Isn't it
that.
wonderful when the only layer that's unacceptable is the one that we were fed as kids?
Yeah, but you get that. I mean, you're teaching Sunday school. You're going to teach,
I
third
know.
graders about Noah, what happens after the flood. I mean, it's ugly.
Yeah.
They're not going to teach that class. As
Uh,
integral as it is to the story, it's like, or Dina, or any of the rest of these
yeah.
things.
So hey, folks, we can't tell you. You're gonna have to come and ask me personally.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, have you read what was it? Oh, Letters from the Earth, which is Mark Twain
no.
writing about the Bible.
No.
And it's I'm trying to remember if it's a dialogue or the letters are from Satan. And he's writing about the Bible. And it's all, sort of a Protestant understanding of the surface Bible. And it's all about how vile it is. And, how rotten all of the stuff that happens is, and how much death and betrayal and bloodshed and all the rest of it that goes on. And how can this book possibly be holy? And that was a question I asked in my bar mitzvah talk as well. But so getting beneath that surface where we are is a better way to look at that, is a much better way to look at that book.
So what I love most about Twain is what he said about Cincinnati, especially when I lived there. Mark Twain said about Cincinnati that if the world came to an end, he'd want to be in Cincinnati because they'd find out about it 2 years later. That to me is the best Twain quote. All right. So one last question, really quickly, just update about your kids. What's going on with them? Fill us in. Let people know who they are.
They're doing great. And we were fortunate or whatever. They were both here over the holidays. So, and we hadn't seen Alana in a year. So Alana's in France, in Paris, and living with her boyfriend and working for the company he works for, which is a job she got, but it's tremendous. It's a company that is marketing a home defibrillator.
Oh, wow.
And in doing that, they have to teach people how to use it, but it's also teaching people about other health things, how you do a Heimlich maneuver, how you do Heimlich maneuver on kids. So she's the one who's generating and producing a lot of their content on that side. Her
Great.
boyfriend is an engineer and a computer genius. So he'd done a lot of the architecture of the device itself, and then he got burned out on that. So they made him not in charge of sales, but part of the sales team. And he promptly put together all these different sales computer generated things to get contacts and everything else. And they just moved to a really nice apartment. So they're in great shape.
And let her know, let her know in as much Jewish guilt as possible is that I haven't heard from her in a while.
I will do that. We're supposed to talk today.
Yeah, say, hey, I was talking to Bruce and he said he hasn't heard from you in a while. What's that about? But go ahead.
Yeah.
Good. Now what about Graham?
And broadcast it to everybody. Like everybody needs to know this. Nicest girl on the face of the planet. She's not calling the rabbi.
She's great. No, she's great. Go on. Great. What about Graham? What's up with Graham?
He is, so he's been in San Francisco as a salesperson for a company it's a drone specialist company that was coming out with another product that had to do with gathering a lot of different types of visual information and translating that into 3D pictures. But then they're selling off that unit to somebody else. And then his girlfriend went to move to North Carolina, which is where she's from, to Raleigh to be at the Duke Medical School because she's a nurse. She's an ER nurse, and she decided, I guess, the action wasn't enough in the ER, so she wants to be a ICU nurse now, intensive care. And so he decided this was a good place for him to move to Raleigh to be with her, and go to business school.
Great.
So, and amazingly, he told us that he had enough money saved up to do all this, which
fantastic.
Wonderful. I don't know that he learned it from us, probably as a negative example. But it's great. They're wonderful kids, and they're both well on their ways to great lives. So I'm just hoping it keeps up.
Amen. Hey, send him my best too, if you would.
I will do that.
And your wonderful wife. And let me just say thanks for taking the time. It's been great schmoozing with you. And
thanks for asking me. This was a lot more fun.
Haka got a chance to see the other side of you. So for the 26 people that are going to watch. So David, it's been an honor. Thanks a lot. That concludes this episode. We'll see you next time.